Hi, I'm Emily Previti of the Pennsylvania Capital Star and host of Folo PA, our podcast focused on how policy affects Pennsylvanians, featuring audio journalism that emphasizes context, accountability, and community impact. In recent years, data center development has been a growing issue in the Commonwealth and around the rest of the country. Communities find themselves grappling with how to manage the risk and opportunity presented by data centers, and so their elected representatives are too. The controversy includes data centers' demand for extraordinary quantities of water and energy, their production of noise pollution, and their link with big tech and artificial intelligence, both of which have been met with increasing disdain from the general public. In Pennsylvania, the topic has also provoked some finger-pointing in the gubernatorial race between incumbent Democrat Josh Shapiro and challenger Republican State Treasurer Stacy Garrity, with each accusing the other of flip-flopping. My colleague Ian Karbal did a deep dive into this dynamic, and he sat down with me to talk about it, alongside Capital Star senior reporter Peter Hall, whose latest reading on the issue included a look at how the matter is playing out in the state legislature, where the push for guardrails seems to be becoming a bipartisan issue, as some Republicans are adopting a position initially held mainly by Democrats. Ian, Pete, thanks to you both for making time to talk.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Pete, of anyone on our team, you've been doing the most reporting on this. So I was wondering what led you to start focusing on this topic initially. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the issue, it hadn't quite blown up yet, at least not to the extent that we're seeing now.
No, it was definitely something that was there in the background, but I went back and looked, and the first time that I used the phrase data center in a story was in the summer of 2024. Constellation Energy announced it was going to restart the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, rebranded as the Crane Clean Energy Center, to power Microsoft data centers. It was a $1.6 billion deal between the companies. Around the same time, our national editor, Robert Zullo, had emailed me with a very dense document from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on connecting large loads to the PJM interconnection grid, which is the regional grid that powers Pennsylvania and 12 other states, and dealt with a question of who is going to pay for data centers to connect to the grid. There's a lot of additional wiring, so to speak, that has to be built anytime you have a large facility like a data center to handle that enormous amount of power, and that costs money. People who think a lot about these things sending up a red flag saying we have to make sure that regular customers don't get stuck with the bill. And that's when I started really looking into how data centers were going to affect people in Pennsylvania.
Yes, and we will delve into that further later in the conversation. You alluded to this before when you were talking about the power grid. This touches a lot of other policy areas. So what are they, and do you see this starting to encompass some others in the near future or further down the road?
Energy is the really big overarching issue, and that is being driven by the fact that PJM, they manage the grid, but they also manage the supply of electricity on the grid by holding auctions for essentially power generators. They call them merchant generators because they have the ability to generate power and sell it on the grid. They aren't really, like in the old days, affiliated with any single utility. They produce power, they sell it on the grid, and they bid to sell that energy to PJM and the utilities and the eventual end users. And in July of 2024, that auction returned a really unprecedented price that caused consumers' electric bills to jump by up to 20%. And that prompted the Shapiro administration to get involved, to intervene through a lawsuit where they prevailed on PJM and FERC to cap the price of electricity in these auctions to keep it from going up even further. Whether that is eventually going to lead to some stability or at least an end to the meteoric rises in energy prices remains to be seen, because at the beginning of June 2026, we saw electricity prices for ratepayers, people like you and I, who pay an electric bill each month, go up again, up to 20% across Pennsylvania.
Speaking of Shapiro, we recently published a story of Ian's about positions on data center development held by gubernatorial candidates Josh Shapiro, our current governor, who's a Democrat, and Stacy Garrity, the Republican state treasurer, who's challenging him. There are so many issues that you could focus on. So what about their stances on this one in particular made you want to delve in and do an enterprise story about it?
Two things really interested me here. The first one was that you had both candidates issuing a very similar line of attack against one another, which is both calling each other massive hypocrites, saying you loved data centers before, you wanted them to come in, you didn't care if they were regulated, and now look, everyone's angry, and all of a sudden you are going to protect everybody. Why should we believe you? And so it is just inherently interesting to me when you have two people sort of saying, I know you are, but what am I? And then the second part of it is that really began to emerge, I would say, in the last couple months as one of the really big rifts between the campaigns. And especially the Garrity campaign seemed to really want to hammer this home. And that said to me that they believed this could be a real winning issue for them, was to paint Josh Shapiro as the guy who wants all these huge data centers to come and change the character of your neighborhood and raise your electric prices. And I'm going to be the person who's going to put a stop to that. That's really been one of the very clear places where you've had an issue or a set of policies that have really started to differentiate them, and where the campaigns seem to think, I can separate myself from the other one.
To boil it down to what those differences are, for voters, how would you differentiate?
Josh Shapiro's platform on this, and largely because he's governor and he's had to deal with this issue in a very real way, his platform is much more clear. And so he has announced what he is calling his grid strategy or grid standards, where he is saying to data center developers, look, you have to meet a bunch of benchmarks in making sure you have sustainable energy, making sure you're working with communities, being transparent about what these things are going to power. And if you do that, then you can have access to things like sped up permitting processes, the state's sales tax exemption for computer equipment that powers data centers, and that is a huge expense for these companies. But those standards are voluntary. A data center could say, you know what, we don't care if we get sped up permitting or your sales tax exemption, and we're not going to follow these standards. And so he's really riding a line there between regulating and trying to address community concerns about these and making sure that development is still possible. He's gotten both praise and criticism for this approach. There are certainly environmental groups who have said this isn't really doing anything. I mean, a voluntary standard is just that. And you have had other groups say, you know what, this is actually a good approach, including environmental groups, labor groups, etc. Stacy Garrity, because as treasurer, she really hasn't been involved in the policy side of this much. And as a candidate, I think she's just starting to stake out her platform. It's a little more vague, but she has made a much stronger call for a total pause on data center development. What happens after that is a little more unclear. But what she said is, look, we need to stop this. I am hearing from local officials and communities across Pennsylvania who don't want these in their backyard, who don't really know how to deal with these giant companies who are coming in and saying, we're buying this piece of land and we want to build this thing here. And so until we can set up a set of guidelines and make sure that these can be done in a way that will not harm communities, we're just going to pause any new developments. That would still allow data center development that has already begun to finish, the data centers that are already here to continue to operate. But she's also made another really interesting call, which is for data center development to be restricted to industrial and brownfield sites. That sort of gets into zoning, but it would be, generally speaking, areas that are further away from residential sites and that have already been zoned for heavy industry.
That's certainly come up in a community that I've been spending time in recently, which we'll get into later in the conversation. But your opening scene for this story it's a year ago, but it's Shapiro making an announcement about data center development, and you can elaborate on that a little bit. But I was curious what you made of Republican Senator Dave McCormick being there. That caught my attention because he is a Republican, clearly, and as you pointed out in the story, at that point, Garrity was favored to be the GOP nominee, even though she wasn't yet officially. Or is there more to it?
So I really chose that as the opening scene because I thought it really drew a stark line to show how this issue has changed both in the political realm and in the public eye in just a year. And what you had there is a time where you had Republican Senator Dave McCormick joining Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro to just praise this development that the Shapiro administration had worked very hard on. And Dave McCormick has been a major booster of data centers and artificial intelligence development in America. Unlike a lot of other politicians on both sides of the aisle, he's really been consistent there. I think just in April, he did an interview with CBS where he said, look, I hear concerns, I understand this, but do you understand the economic development that can come from creating these data centers, the jobs that will bring? I mean, do you understand how important it is to the United States to be leading the artificial intelligence battle, particularly against China, which is something that Josh Shapiro has echoed as well. And so you just had almost like this halcyon moment of everyone coming together and saying, look, we're making these huge data centers with Amazon, these data center campuses. They're investing $20 billion in Pennsylvania, and that's just being celebrated as this amazing thing. Stacy Garrity weighed in as well and said, this is awesome. Very happy this is happening. This is going to be great for jobs. It's just such a hard contrast to where things are now, where you have Shapiro and Garrity sort of fighting to prove they're the ones that can be trusted to make sure these things don't harm communities, that they're the ones who hears people's concerns. Polling shows as well that people are really worried about these. A lot of people do not want them in their backyard. And there are real concerns about that. And I think as data centers have proliferated in the last year to power this artificial intelligence industry, where all of a sudden you're starting to see the negative effects. There's the environmental concerns about how much water they use. There's the stress on the power grid that Pete talked a lot about. And there have been things that have come to light, like, hey, these things cause some serious noise pollution. And even if they meet local noise ordinances, neighbors can still be sort of exposed to this just constant low hum. And that's just a real quality of life problem, let alone a possible health problem. And so I felt it set up that landscape in a story that's really trying to parse, like, okay, both of these guys are calling each other hypocrites. Are they? That was the initial stance.
Well, first, Pete, did you want to jump in here as far as anything else that you might have taken from McCormick being there?
Ian covered it pretty well, but I would just add from last summer, McCormick held a summit in Pittsburgh on energy and artificial intelligence. And it was really clear from that he sees this as a transformational opportunity for Pennsylvania. And he really focused on leveraging what strengths we have in Pennsylvania as far as serving this new industry. One of the areas that he highlighted was the fact that essentially commercial nuclear power in America was invented in Pittsburgh with Westinghouse. His summit featured an announcement that Westinghouse, support from the Trump administration, was going to work toward building, I believe it was up to 10 new large nuclear reactors on the scale of something like 3 Mile Island or Limerick in the Philadelphia area. Those would not be in Pennsylvania, obviously, all of them, but a lot of the economic activity surrounding that would come home to Pennsylvania. In all, they announced $90 billion in investments in Pennsylvania, ranging from rehabilitation or reinvestment in 100-year-old hydroelectric dams to 3 Mile Island to the campus in north central Pennsylvania that Ian was talking about, that Governor Shapiro and Senator McCormick announced. And I'll sort of dial back here because I don't know how much to attribute to McCormick in terms of these things actually coming together, but he's definitely aggregated the opportunities that exist in Pennsylvania for this to be a big economic shot in the arm.
That was very well put. And picking up on what we said about McCormick being in the minority when it comes to consistency by our elected leaders on this issue, just to be clear, both Garrity and Shapiro have definitely at a minimum evolved their positions about data center development, and sometimes that's because things change, and this is with any issue, and people are learning more, and that's both our policymakers and the public. And if that's in good faith, it can be beneficial. Where is the line? And when you watch that happening, are there sometimes signals, or do you sometimes have a gut check or get a sense that it is somehow, what's a flip-flop versus a good faith evolution in policy because more information has been gained?
So I don't know that there is a clear line on that. And as much as I have written a story with a question mark in the headline going, so are these guys hypocrites? Like, I sort of just lay it out and let the audience decide if they really flip-flopped with a capital F. I will say Shapiro, what's really changed with him is the way he talks about data centers. He went from speaking about, much like Senator McCormick, the development of artificial intelligence in Pennsylvania in epochal terms. We are in a battle with China for AI supremacy, and we want artificial intelligence to be developed by hardworking Pennsylvanians with Pennsylvania power, blah, 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 to really saying, hey, I hear you guys' concerns. We're going to make sure that this is done in a community-first way, that it's not going to harm anyone. It is not going to make your neighborhood a more difficult place to live. It's not going to make your power more expensive. I hear you. I am going to protect you from that while making sure that we do benefit from the rise of this industry. I do think the way Garrity talks about this has changed in a much more substantial way, where she's gone from, this is amazing, this is going to bring jobs, we need to deregulate so that we can catch up to our neighboring states when it comes to developing data centers. One thing she liked to talk about a lot around a year ago was that Ohio had more than twice as many data centers as Pennsylvania, and we needed to catch up, and they were, to quote her, eating our lunch. And to go from that to we need to put a whole pause on developing these, I mean, that's a pretty stark switch. And it's interesting, I was in a gaggle of reporters where we got the chance to question her about this. And she was very quick to say, I have never changed my position on this. And I have always said that we need to protect communities while we're doing this. And she has been saying that for the last few months since speaking as the gubernatorial candidate. But when she was really pressed on, hey, like, what do you mean you've been consistent? I mean, some of the people I was with said, you know, we've interviewed you. You gave a very different point of view, or at least what seemed like that a year ago. What's changed? She really did say, well, listen, I've learned a lot about this issue. I've spent time, and she has truly spent time talking to local community leaders and officials about the struggles they're having deciding how to regulate these things on the local level, because municipal zoning is a huge part of deciding where a data center can go, and they have real power over that. And so on the one hand, she said she's learned, and on the other hand, the other part of that answer that she gave was, well, when I was talking about how great things like the Amazon data center were, I was speaking strictly as a treasurer, and my job there was just bringing money into Pennsylvania and trying to find ways to deal with our deficit. And now I'm speaking to you as someone who wants to be your governor, and that's just a very different set of concerns. So you can take from that what you will.
It's not so much that there's a line, but it's about the framing and whether the person can just say, yeah, I've learned more, instead of, if their position has evolved, maybe refraining from saying that's an evolution and then saying the other person's change is a flip-flop and hypocrisy.
Right. And, I think the other thing that maybe I probably should have talked to when you asked me what drew me to this story is the politics around data centers. And I mean politics with a lowercase p here, are really fascinating. A big part of what has made this early into the gubernatorial campaign such a big issue. Because, you do see polling. People don't trust data centers. They don't trust artificial intelligence. And a politician is understanding, one, the issue itself and what they should be doing about it as someone with power over policy. And on the other hand, I think understanding what their constituents are feeling about this. And there's so much baggage around the issue. I think a lot of people have very strong feelings about the tech industry in America. It is right now powering our economy. It is in some ways holding up the stock market, which everyone wants to be good so that their retirement funds are strong. There's the other baggage of it that there's a lot of, in the political world, fear around it. So if you're a Democrat, maybe you look at someone like Elon Musk, and he is representative of the tech industry to you and people who want to build these data centers. He was a huge supporter of Donald Trump's campaign. He was a person that was the head of Doge. You look at the way misinformation spread on sites like Facebook ahead of the 2016 election. And if you're a Republican, maybe you look at that and you say, well, what power did all of these tech CEOs have to ban the president of the United States from social media companies? There's fears of censorship there. And all of that goes into, I think, the way people think about data centers, as well as concerns about artificial intelligence, which for a long time, the CEOs of artificial intelligence companies were talking about their P-dooms, which was hey, how likely do you think it is that this technology is going to blow up the world? I don't know. I think 5%. I think 1%. And that's a scary thing to hear. And then you have people saying, oh, well, it's going to take all your jobs. Also a very scary thing to hear. And that's all tied together here. And in part, what Josh Shapiro and Stacy Garrity are responding to and what any politician has to figure out how to navigate, along with the fact that this industry is growing really fast and a data center can bring a lot of jobs, a lot of revenue. How do you think about all that and wrap your brain around it?
Pivoting to the legislature, we've seen this with other issues that sometimes our lawmakers respond to a hot button topic with a tsunami of legislation, and that's understandable because their constituents, as you're describing, it's already happening with this, and constituents might be demanding that some kind of action or response from their elected representatives, from their legislators. Another recent example of this are the 24 or so bills in response to federal immigration agents, and in some cases, local police arresting and detaining people as part of the mass deportation pushed by the Trump administration. And so when so many pieces of legislation meant to address an issue, and I think in some cases maybe one that the lawmakers are not familiar with, either because it's new or it's emerging or it's typically dealt with by another branch of government, when so many pieces of legislation with that backdrop are thrown into the mix, they can't all be bangers, and they could miss the mark in a significant way policy-wise, or for others, it's unlikely they'll get very far or ultimately become law for political reasons. So, Pete, I know that you just worked on a story that was a roundup of legislation. Have any of these bills caught your attention as far as having a real shot at gaining traction?
The House passed a trio of bills out of at least a couple of dozen that deal with data centers. The main bill, we mentioned Governor Shapiro's grid standards, which are the standards that data center developers would have to optionally achieve in order to get this tax break on computer equipment. That passed in the House along with a bill that would give municipalities the option of enacting a 180-day pause on considering land use applications for data centers. The idea behind the pause is that a lot of rural townships where these data centers are being planned, again, because that's where the open space is, don't have zoning ordinances, or if they do, they're 50 years old and never envisioned million square foot buildings with their own power supplies and all of the things that come along with this. So to give these municipalities a fighting chance to plan with the developers to make sure that they work for the community, they're going to have the option to say, we're not taking applications right now, and we'll hang on to that for you, and when our 180 days is up, then your application is deemed filed. The third bill is a head-scratcher, but illustrates the fluidity of the politics around this issue. The grid standards, again, those deal with energy efficiency, bringing your own energy. They deal with transparency, with community engagement, workforce development, and a host of other sub-issues within those. If the developers can demonstrate that they're going to meet all of those benchmarks, they'll get that 6% sales tax exemption on all of the computer equipment that goes into the data centers. The third bill eliminates that sales tax exemption, and that is coming from a place where lawmakers feel that these big tech companies are really performing an act of wealth transfer by taking the resources that we have in Pennsylvania, whether it is a robust electrical infrastructure that can serve these, that they don't have to spend money on, or whether it's water that's going to be used for cooling.
Yeah, I believe that the quote from Katie Muth was that billionaire tech bros are invading the Commonwealth or something.
Craig Williams, who's a state representative from Delaware County, a Republican, had a good line yesterday that these are companies that shoot rockets into space and then bring them back and land them in the place where they took off from. They don't need our 6% sales tax exemption. So I think that comes from a place where lawmakers and their constituents are feeling that we shouldn't have any giveaways.
The grid standards of Shapiro's they wouldn't be mandatory. Some say that they need to be. How realistic do you see that being?
Everybody who touches these laws is going to be looking out for the possibility that they could be tarred with the responsibility for scaring data centers away from Pennsylvania, and then we don't get any of the jobs. We don't get any of the economic benefits. So I think they're trying to walk a fine line between what they have to do and what would be ideal for them to do.
Yeah, I would also add that I think politicians are worried of being targeted with money in elections, either attack ads against them, boosting opponents in either primaries or general elections. That is also a concern. But as far as likelihood goes, it's Josh Shapiro's plan. He is a Democrat, and he holds a lot of sway over the party there, and it would have to be signed by him. And secondly, the Senate majority leaders, who are Republicans, or the leaders in the Senate Republican caucus, they really want this economic development. And it's not entirely clear to me whether they would run a bill that made that mandatory, whether or not it had the votes to pass the chamber.
And for your recent story, you interviewed environmental attorneys and other experts. And did any of them flag any legislation for being particularly good, being unrealistic in terms of passage, missing the mark, etc.?
You know, I'm thinking about one attorney I talked to in particular, and his real emphasis, or where he felt lawmakers needed to be acting and that none really were at the moment, at least in any way that could lead to legislation being passed at this point, is his point of view was what you really need is legislation that makes everything about a data center development transparent. You need to know who is funding this, what it's going to power, how much water is it going to use, how much energy is it going to use, where is it going to get that energy, how much noise is it going to make, how much light is it going to be, what is it going to look like. Any question that a community member may have about what this data center that's being built blocks or miles from their home is going to look like, people should be able to have that answer. And most importantly, what he said was that you need to have lawmakers promote a process that allows people to have input into that. So if you learn that answer and you don't like that answer, that you can go to your local officials and actually spur change on it or help halt data center development. That's a tricky thing to pass because it could mean a lot of data center development not being able to happen. And how much power do you give concerned community members, and how do you make that decision? I mean, if it's just a small handful of people being very noisy about it, can that stop data center development? And that was his real emphasis to me, that you have to have transparency and you have to have a process that allows public input here. He was also not a big fan of Governor Shapiro's grid plan. He felt that the rules that existed as they're written could be hard to enforce, and that there's a lot of language about things that benchmarks that these companies need to mean without a ton of clarity always about how exactly those benchmarks are met. Pete, would you co-sign that? Like on the grid standards, you're probably more familiar with the rules themselves and the way it's written.
Well, the way the grid standards are written, it's going to be a very detail-oriented process for administration to keep tabs on these projects, to maintain their certifications. They will have to submit annual reports, I believe, under the law, showing that they have continued to meet these benchmarks. But the enforcement of it is going to be a laborious process if they intend to strictly enforce these guidelines.
We touched on the community near 3 Mile Island and they're being triggered, understandably, by reopening. And thinking about other areas of the state, I know in northeastern Pennsylvania, where I've been spending time reporting, Ian's story about Garrity and Shapiro opening in that area, that's the coal region. And the mining industry is basically dead, but it's still core to the area's identity, hence the name still. And the problems communities there continue to have to confront from it. As Pete, you mentioned, even a more recent example, but then also a call back to the history that our state has with extractive industries.
I live in southeast Pennsylvania in Chester County, and there has been opposition to several data center projects in this area. And a neighbor of mine mentioned to me the other day that this is coming largely out of the experience that people have had around here with pipelines. On a more statewide scale, people have had bad experiences with fracking. The extraction of natural gas has changed the landscape of some parts of Pennsylvania over the last 20 years, or maybe 15 years or so. We've seen environmental disasters be forewarned and come to be reality in parts of the state where people can't drink their water anymore. So when people hear that data centers are coming, artificial intelligence is coming to Pennsylvania because we've got the power, we've got the natural gas, they see this as fracking and pipeline construction all over again. In Chester County, major pipeline, the Mariner East pipeline, runs from western Pennsylvania, where the gas is extracted, to Philadelphia, where it is processed. And in the construction of that pipeline across Pennsylvania, there were all kinds of problems with drilling mud getting into people's wells and into a lake at State Park near here, sinkholes and subsidence. And the memory of that in the last 10 years is fresh enough that you're seeing a really pitched opposition to it.
I have been keeping my eye on a different issue as it's manifesting in Schuylkill County, and that is the development of a detention center in Tremont Township. Now it looks like it probably won't happen, but while I've been monitoring public meetings during the past few months, I noticed it starting to share the stage with data center development. So now that data center development has become the main thing. And some people have said, what else are we going to do with this land that's limited in reuse because of the abandoned mines that haven't been mitigated, etc.? And is there a way to do this that people have been talking about so things don't end up worse than they already are, even on this land that is zoned and probably limited to industrial reuse?
I think that's what the grid standards attempt to do. There's certainly a feeling among some people that they need to be mandatory rather than an extra, that a hoop they can jump through to get a tax break is one way it's been described. It can be done in ways that minimize the disruption, minimize the impact. The big one is to ensure that data centers have a dedicated supply of energy, whether that's being located next to an existing source like the campus that Governor Shapiro did his big announcement for in 2024 in Luzerne County. That is next to an existing nuclear plant. It's going to have impacts on the community, but it's not going to require the construction of a new natural gas-fired power plant, which has obviously climate impacts and necessitates the continuation of fracking. There are concerns about water use. Millions of gallons of water flow through a data center to cool these computers. You know how hot your laptop gets sitting on your lap. You can imagine if there are 1 million of those running away in the same building. They need to be cooled. Closed-loop cooling systems are one of the technologies that people are pushing for to ensure that we're not taking fresh drinking water out of municipal systems and running it through the data centers and then running it into the nearest creek or river. The water would get recycled. So there are ways that can minimize the impact.
Some people, proponents, complain, or some have complained about misinformation about data center development. And have you noticed, either of you noticed that at all? And if so, what have you seen? Where have you seen it?
Well, the industry is very quick to point out that data centers have been around as long as the internet. They aren't just for artificial intelligence or development of artificial intelligence. They're powering things that we've used for years, like streaming entertainment and e-commerce and email and texting, all kinds of communications applications. The difference is that we haven't been dealing with hyperscale data centers, which, if you ask the average person to point out a data center, they wouldn't be able to do it. The new ones are going to be on such a completely different scale that it's going to be hard to miss them.
I don't know that I have a lot to add, but I would highlight what Pete said, where you have the industry line on one hand that, hey, you can have closed-loop data centers that, in spite of using a lot of water, are really not draining the resource like people are saying. You have a lot of other concerned community members citing these massive numbers of gallons of water that are using. That's just like one example of a place where you have these two starkly different narratives, and it can be really hard, even as a reporter, hard to keep track of and understand what is the reality of these situations. And there's just so much information out there that point to really different conclusions you could make about the impact the data center will actually have. It's just a lot to keep track of.
Absolutely. Picking up on that, when it comes to this issue and public dialogue and policy debates about this, does it seem like there is maybe an overemphasis on certain aspects of this issue? And then, are there points that you think might be getting lost in public dialogue or not getting enough attention?
I think there is just so much focus on this. A lot is being discussed. And I mean, if anything is getting lost, it's just because of how complicated the issue is and how many parts of it there are. I mean, when you're talking about the economy, the environment, just what it means to live next to one of these things, it can be hard to zero in on any of those issues in particular.
It is a great example of not being able to see the forest for the trees because, yeah, there are so many aspects to it that it's easy to get focused on one and not see the next challenge coming.
Which is a different issue than the one I was asking about, which is like, and I think we've all covered stuff like this where certain people who are particularly vocal become fixated on an aspect of an issue that isn't really that impactful to it overall. I know that we've all sat there and thought, oh my God, please move on from this. It doesn't matter as much as all this other stuff that you haven't gotten to.
I think one aspect of it that may be not getting examined closely enough is how much of this is speculative and how many of these projects are actually going to be built in the end. There are dozens of active applications across Pennsylvania, but even winning approval for a project doesn't guarantee that it's going to be built. To go back to the energy side of things, one of the issues raised in reforming how the regional grid, PJM, operates is their forecasting. And it is a bit more formal than I'll make it sound here, but they go to each of the regional or local distribution companies, the local electrical utilities, and say, hey, what kind of interest have you had in connecting to your grid? And from that, they put together a forecast saying the demand for electricity is going to go up, or it's going to stay the same, or it'll go down. But the forecasts have included all of these data center applications, and we don't really know how many of these are going to come to fruition. There are some folks out there who are saying that a lot of this is overblown.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you guys both so much for making the time to talk about this issue and for your reporting on it.
Thank you for having us, Emily.
Yeah, thanks so much.
You've been listening to Folo PA, Pennsylvania Capital Star's podcast focused on how policy affects Pennsylvanians, featuring audio journalism that emphasizes context, accountability, and community impact. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd like what you've heard, we'd love it if you'd recommend it to a friend. To stay updated on the newest episodes and other work by our team, you can subscribe to the Capital Star's newsletter, The Morning Guide, at pencapital-star.com, and we've included that link in our show notes. Our theme music is Dusk by Mr. Smith, courtesy of the Free Music Archive, licensed under an Attribution 4.0 international license. Folo PA is edited by the Capital Star's Editor-in-Chief Tim Lambert, and it's hosted and produced by me, Emily Previti. Thanks for listening.